Chapter 12, Lecture 2, starts out with a very critical acronym that you need to know. It is HIPCO. Your book actually is HIPPO, but in the recent years, the C has been added. These are the reasons and the threats to species, and really the reason that many of them are becoming extinct. Number one reason animals become extinct is habitat destruction, degradation, in other words, destroying them, and fragmentation. Fragmentation of a environment is actually bad in many regards because it introduces things like invasive species. So it's taking down part of your habitat. Invasive species or non-native species push natural species out and outcompete them. Population and resource use. In other words, as our population increases, of course, we're tearing down habitat, we're using more resources. Pollution, climate change, that's the C, the new one, and overexploitation. In other words, overusing these animals, even as pets. We're going to break each of these down. Here are a couple of characteristics that make species go extinct. Low reproductive rate, of course, case strategist. If a species only has a limited amount of offspring, only every 10 years, for example, like an elephant, and they have one offspring, of course they're very prone to extinction. They have a very specialized niche. Narrow distribution. If they're only found in small parts of the world, if that part of the world is being destroyed, boom, gone. They feed at high trophic level. If the animals below there are being affected, of course, they're going to be affected also. If they have fixed migratory patterns, they're easy prey. If they're rare, people like to pay lots of money for rare things, and of course, they make the poachers make lots of money off of it, and of course, they're going to keep doing it, unfortunately. So it's very similar to if they're commercially valuable, and if they have actually sometimes large territories too. If we have something like California condor, which has a large territory need, if part of that territory is actually destroyed, of course, they're going to extinction too. So let's talk habitat loss. Deforestation in tropical rainforests is the greatest threat to a species right now. As you know, tropical rainforests are a haven for speciation and holding a number of species that we don't even know about yet. And if we destroy that, of course, we're destroying some things that we may not even know exist already. Temperate biomes are compromised by development. Of course, we live in a temperate biome. We'd like to tear down these forests in order to build homes, in order to grow more food. Major habitat disturbance factors, of course, as I've said, agriculture, commercial development, in other words, buildings, water development. Down in Florida, when they put the channels in, that actually, because everybody likes to live on water, what happens is that's going to destroy some terrestrial habitat. Outdoor recreation, livestock raising, and of course, pollution down a little bit too. When we have these things called habitat islands, what happens is we have a forest, for example, but it's surrounded by maybe even a neighborhood, and that creates an island. If you think about something called endemic species, they live in some creatures only live like in Madagascar. Those are found nowhere else on Earth. So if we threaten that habitat island, that Madagascar island, what happens is that species is going to be prone to extinction because it doesn't live anywhere else on the planet. Habitat fragmentation, remember, can lead to greatest vulnerability to predators and disease. Fragmentation is when we just destroy part of a habitat, but that opens up a corridor for things like predators and diseases, invasive species in order to come in. Species are then limited in the ability to colonize and build new homes. So if we have this magical thing called habitat fragmentation, species are then very limited on where they can colonize, and they're getting hit by invasives generally and diseases. Next thing, let's take a look at the percentage of various species types threatened with premature extinction from human activities. Look at fish. 34% overall of fish are getting hit and likely to become extinct. 51% of those is freshwater species. The reason is we like to eat those. Mammals, 25%, like the great silverback gorilla. That's getting hammered because of being killed to eat, and it's also because of habitat destruction. Reptiles, 20%. We like reptiles as pets, and they're getting caught like as bycatch in fishing nets. Plants about 14%. We like them, they're pretty. Birds about 12%. Habitat loss and fragmentation, of course, are devastating, particularly things like birds. We are clearing forests for farms, lumber, plantation, roads, and development. And what's happening is that is intentionally introducing non-native species, parasites into the world of birds. As a rule of thumb, if birds become extinct, they are an indicator species. That means something is wrong with our environment. They can get caught up in things like fishing equipment. They can get caught up, as you can see in the picture on the right, in oil spills. Pesticides are getting birds. Herbicides are getting birds. Ingestion of toxic lead shotgun pellets. So what happens is it used to be legal to hunt waterfowl, or in other words, ducks and geese using lead shot, but that's not anymore because that lead was getting in the environment and it was getting particularly into the birds and killing them. Migrating birds oftentimes fly into power lines, communication towers, skyscrapers, so birds are really becoming extinct early. Here's a couple things that are looking at habitat destruction. We have this Indian tiger. If you look at the orange, that's its normal range, but because of population growing so much, we're pushing them into small areas. There's only about 20 left right now. The black rhino, again, the natural range is in the orange. We're pushing it into very small areas. The African elephant, orange is the probable range. If you look at today, there's only about 300,000 of these left. They're dying. This is Asian or Indian elephant, again, being pushed in. A lot of times these were being hunted, particularly for their just left to rot. Invasive species is another, that's the I in HIPCO. That's another reason that some species are becoming extinct, is because new species ultimately are coming in and taking over. So they may be accidentally or intentionally introduced. A lot of times they have no natural predators, no competition. They outcompete the native species. They have no parasites that help keep their population in check, no pathogens like bacteria or viruses, and they generally are selected species with high reproductive rates. Some are generalists too, but generally as a rule of thumb, there are selected species. Best prevention is to inspect things like imported goods. You cannot go into states like Florida or Arizona or even California with citrus, because that may introduce a new citrus type of bug or pathogen into their citrus and it would devastate their crops. Clean boat bilge, that's one reason the zebra mussel got here from Europe. We'll talk about that a little later. Actually, Asia, as it came in the bilge of big boats. Use only local firewood right now. That's a huge thing in Wisconsin. We don't want to transport the ash borer, which hides in the bark of trees, cut the firewood down and then bring it up here to burn. So that's illegal to do. We need to brush our dogs after taking them for a walk because they'll get little things like cockleburrs and other seeds stuck on them. Do not buy plants from other states too, because they may bring species. An example is the kudzu vine. Kudzu vine was brought in from Japan in the 1930s to help prevent soil erosion. It's deemed the vine that ate the South. It's doing an excellent job at creating habitats to prevent soil erosion. The problem is it's taking over. This is deemed to grow at least a foot a day. They're better to replace or be a way to make paper someday. This one's ridiculously gross. The Argentina fire ant, which was introduced in the 1930s to regions like Florida and Alabama and spreading since then. Pesticide, they did try to use pesticides on these things to kill them in the 1950s and 1960s. They just spread even further. And of course, you can see what their bite does to people. The Burmese python is something, they were pets at one time down in Florida, and now they're all over and wreaking havoc in the area. First of all, what do we need to do? For invasive species, we need to prevent them from coming in the first place. That's really hard to do. Is it realistic? Need to learn the characteristics of the species. What can they live in? What can they live without? Set up research programs for these creatures and try to find natural controls to use them. You're going to do a little research class. Deer population, of course, we've talked about this extensively. Wisconsin, obviously, we have a huge deer population in some regards. They're edge species. They like to live on the edge of the forest. So think about, they come out of the forest and eat your birdseed in your backyard, and then they go back into the forest. So they like to hover along that edge. They unfortunately kill more people in the United States than any other species, and of course that's because we hit them with our cars. There's really no easy answer to get rid of the deer population. Of course, in Brookfield, they've tried sharpshooters, they're live trapping in Elm Grove right now. Maybe birth control, maybe feed them and put some birth control in there that prevents them from having more offspring or hunt. Now in Wisconsin, of course, they have what's called a metro hunt, which means you can hunt with bow and arrow in certain cities. A very bad thing are things like poaching and smuggling of animals, and we'll talk again extensively on this in class too, but you've got to realize a lot of times the animals that we buy, not necessarily even puppies, but a lot of times things like turtles or frogs, or reptiles that come from other nations, about two-thirds of them actually die in transit. Sometimes some countries buy animal parts, shark fins. Sharks are getting devastated right now because people like to eat shark fin soup, which is illegal in the United States, although you can buy it in California. Pets. For every pet sold, about 50 perish. Terrible. Plants for landscaping and enjoyment. Oftentimes we bring them in from other nations, and they can actually push out. Rising demand for bushmeat in Africa. The reality is with populations increasing in regions like Africa, we're moving deeper into the jungles. So we're seeing an 8-time increase in African population. Because of that, we're getting increased logging and mining in remote areas. We've got a lot of poverty. Poverty, again, drives a lot of this. The bushmeat hunting has caused the local extinction. So local extinction just in that area, fortunately, of many animals in West Africa. You got to realize that it's very common for people to eat things like those gorilla brains. It's a delicacy. The thing is, it can spread HIV or AIDS, even the Ebola virus, because we're eating those oftentimes without cooking them. Depletes food for predators, and of course can decrease in seed dispersing animals too. They would normally eat fruit and then disperse them other places. Climate change, of course, the sea in HIPCO, threatened species. Global warming really is altering habitat. Species can't adapt fast enough. It said, of course, on the pattern we're going by 2050, we will have the climate patterns of Missouri, like St. Louis, which is considerably warmer than what we do. So it's going to happen as those animals are going to move up, and the animals we currently have here now are going to move further north because they're used to the colder weather. Pollution has affected us too. We've degraded our environment and killed a lot of animals with broad spectrum pesticides. In Wisconsin, of course, we know that bees are getting destroyed big time, and we think it's either from pesticides or even from genetically modified organisms. We need bees in order to pollinate. Of course, bioaccumulation versus biomagnification is occurring in our environment. Bioaccumulation is when you eat something and you get more and more accumulated in the fatty tissues of your body. And biomagnification is as you go higher up in a food chain, you get more of the toxin. So here's the honeybees, just to expand a little bit more. They're responsible for about 80% of insect-pollinated plants. And we don't know what's actually killing them in Wisconsin. The suspect is either pesticides. It could be GMOs. That's a new idea right now. It could be there's a parasite out there. It could be like a fungus even that's attacking them. We don't know. But the problem is we need them. All right, that's it for Lecture 2.